Good morning, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jim Kuipers. I'm a mining and mineral processing engineer, originally from Butte, Montana. Presently, I'm based in Wisdom, Montana. About 26 years ago, I think it was, I first decided to leave the mining industry, if you will, and started working with Northern Plains Resource Council, actually as my first client. I just remembered that this morning. And that was on the Clean Water Act campaign. But since then, I've worked with public interest groups, indigenous peoples, private individuals, public interest organizations throughout the US, Canada, the world, really, in various ways. And one of the things I'm more recently doing is focusing on the whole decarbonization, energy transition discussion. And so I look forward to our conversation today.
Okay, I have a notice on my screen. Can you get rid of that for me? We have to have it here. Thank you. Okay, well, what I'm going to do is address a different question to each of our speakers, and at any point when sale arrives, we can bring her into the session. I'll start with Jim. And each speaker will have 12 minutes to tell us, to respond to the question that they've been warned about these questions, so this is not unfair. So first for Jim, what are the material realities of this, what we hope is a just transition as we imagine it, and particularly in terms of the necessary minerals and the mining activities?
And do you know if you're showing the slideshow or if I should use the share screen on my screen to do this?
Yeah. You should do it, Jim.
Can folks see that?
Yeah.
Okay. I just got a few slides here that I want to cover, but give you kind of a sense, if you will, and that's about all we can do in 12 minutes of what's happening with mining and what all this means in terms of things. But let me start with, you notice I'm using the words decarbonization. The idea of kind of green energy, green mining, all these other things, even renewable, et cetera. I think we need to put a little bit of a question mark behind all those things. And really, a lot of this discussion is if we undertake simply a decarbonization approach, what does that mean? Essentially moving away from fossil fuels and all those other type of things that others oftentimes discuss. Okay, so I think we oftentimes focus on what I'm showing here on the right-hand side, which is the kind of end products, the wind turbines, the solar cells, the electrical vehicle and other storage batteries. But what we need to realize is, from the installation, when you really go back up the chain of custody, up the supply chain is a better way to put it, what you ultimately see is you have to start with extraction. And this is the mining that Northern Plains folks are very familiar with respect to coal, but also on the other side, things like platinum group minerals that Stillwater mining is mining are more applicable even to this situation. That extraction, we all know, even at its best, it has issues. Refining is something that, for example, really, other than a few smelters in the US, one of the few being the smelter in Columbus, that doesn't exist. In the US, largely Canada, other places, it has migrated to developing countries, to places where there aren't regulations, where places like China, et cetera, components and manufacturing, we might mine it here or somewhere else in the free world, et cetera, but it ends up going almost inevitably to one or two or three places. And lithium is a good example in that things ultimately typically end up going to China. Now, as was mentioned, when we talk about this decarbonization effort, it takes a lot of metals, translating to a lot of mining. And this is just one example for what it would require for electrical vehicle cars, looking at 20 million cars a year from Tesla. And this shows what you would need per year as well as per car. And again, there's a whole list of things here. There are other things in addition to this list that are necessary to build a solar cell, to build a solar turbine, or not a solar, to build a wind turbine, various things like that. So this is actually just a part of the list, if you will. But you can see it's fairly significant. And there's quite a bit of diversity in all this, all these different requirements. Now, this is showing the global lithium market in 2021. Okay, and if this market stayed, it would be one picture. But what I'm going to show you next is, whereas today or in 2021, a year ago, 75% of the market, to 74%, was batteries, and primarily starting to be EV batteries. When we look to the future, that demand just skyrockets. And this is if we take the approach we're presently taking, where the idea is to basically try to allow us to continue to do what we're doing, if you will. And we just try to undertake this to replace it by mining our way out of the problem. And even with recycling and some other perhaps technologies that might emerge, I think, as you'll hear, there are a lot of questions about things. Now, just want to make sure that, this is lithium. We're going to see different metals or minerals having different cycles that go up, but almost everyone, copper, for example, instead of 500% over the next 30 years, as is inferred here, it might only be 200%, but almost all the metals we're mining, it's going to increase as we go up this path. And one of the things I just note for folks is, when you look, more lithium will be needed in 2032 than was mined in the previous 7 years. And then look down here at what was mined before that. What you start to realize is we're going to mine more metals, particularly in this whole sector, if you will, in the next 20 years than we probably ever mined ever in history. And that's something to really, it should cause us all to give the real thought. This just shows, again, one of the things that I think really we have to focus on is, this shows what's happened from 2016 and is forecast to happen through 2025. And the BEVs is the electrical vehicles. But ultimately, energy storage, right here with that orange, that's only up here, it has to increase far beyond what we're showing for electrical vehicles, far beyond that. So there's incredible demand coming up, even if we do start to solve some of our problems. Now, talk a little bit about where it's all going to come from before I close. But right now, if you look at mine production, it comes from Australia, and that might surprise most of you. But Australia has spodumene mines, and it's actually a hard rock mining product. But in Australia, they mine the ore. Sometimes they might concentrate it, but typically they don't even concentrate it. And it gets shipped to China. A smaller amount gets shipped perhaps to Korea and Japan. But by far, the vast majority that's mined in Australia goes to China, where it's then further processed down that chain that I showed you, literally with them producing 85% of the battery metal that's needed in terms of high purity battery metal right now comes out of China. Now, there's other material that comes out of Chile, but again, no real refining capacity there. And then you can see China has a fairly large amount. If the United States was shown, it would be about 1% today. Now, in terms of reserves, though, we're going to see a shift. Argentina, and if you look at reserves, mean what we know about and can confidently say is there today, whereas resources is more a category of, well, this is what we think is there. And that resources could change in the future. But right now, we would look to Argentina, Bolivia, which has no real, we know it is, we just know there's a lot of the same features as Argentina and Chile. But you're going to see that we'll really head towards the distribution of resources as well as reserves in the future. In the United States, if we were to tap all those resources, might be able to supply our own needs, but as you're going to hear, there's issues all around about that, as well as mining anywhere here. There's no good place to go do all this. I need to make that clear. So just to wrap up, in terms of what does this all really mean in terms of minerals and mining, first, as I said, when you look at what we're talking about for even things like copper, iron, in the next 20 years, we're going to mine as much as we have historically. And if you look at all the impacts we've had socially, economically, environmentally from that previous period, and you concentrate them in 20 years, even if you do things the best you can, getting to it will not be green, we're going to have real impacts. And folks, it won't be green. We know, because we work with a lot of different people, that even under the best circumstance, impacts can be limited, but they're still going to happen, and they will be significant. One of the things that I think is most problematic is this whole idea of where should we mine? Whose nest shall we foul? In a lot of ways is almost how you have to put it. Yet having said that, I'm a strong believer that we cannot sit here and fail to act. As a society, as a global society, we have to do something, and we have to lead, those of us in developed countries. A very serious factor, just so folks are aware, is when I read the mining magazines, I keep up with what the industry is saying. The industry doesn't think they can even come close. They expect to make a lot of money because they know they can't, the supply will not meet the demand. But the questions are, we don't have engineers, we don't have a lot of the technical capacity, for example, that China has in processing. And where's all this capital going to come from to build the industry and do it right? And that's not cheap. So my conclusion is that the transition is questionable. I think, partial. Even if we undertook our best effort, I think it will take 100 years to get to perhaps 50%. Which leads me to my final conclusion, and I hope this is a good lead on to some of the other speakers, is, I think just simply talking about transitioning, that isn't enough. There has to be a transformation. We as a society have to realize that we can't transition our way out of the fact that we simply use way too much energy. The use of energy is disproportionate. I think we're overall going to have to do two things. One is transition where we can and where it's reasonable, but also maybe cut, particularly those of us in developed countries, our demand by 75%, allow those that need it to actually have power and enjoy that, so they can have some of what we have. And we need per capita equity. We can't have people out there burning 1,000 times more than those who are less privileged amongst us. So I'll close with that and look forward to our conversation later. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And we will have time for questions after, so write them down as you think of them. And it looks like Sayoko is here. Okay. And I'm going to first give Sayoko a chance to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are with, what you do, and what you hope to tell us about today, just very briefly.
Hello, everyone. I'm calling to you from Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt. Here's the palm tree behind me. Can you guys see it? It's been a whirlwind here at COP. I have learned so much, seen so many crazy false solutions here at COP. So just to introduce myself to those who don't know me, my name is Sayogla Kindness Williams. I come from the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, and I'm WMAN Indigenous Caucus Coordinator. And we just had our big biannual conference where we brought in over 100 Indigenous people from all across North America territories, well, Canada and the US. And so we were in the homelands of the Reno Sparks Indian Colony in Reno, Nevada. And they themselves are part of the battle to stop the destruction of a sacred site called Pimaha, actually known as Thacker Pass. And it's a proposed lithium mine up there. And it's been approved by the Biden administration. You know, they are supporting this mine going through, but it's currently stopped as far as I know. I mean, I have been gone a week now, but when we were down there, it was still being, there was still some litigation in the case. So they are what I believe is going to be the first test case in the country, like to meet the demand for the EV batteries in the US. And so if this mine does go in, and it is moving very quickly, rapidly compared to the average time that it takes to permit and, you know, get a mine going, which I have read, and I don't know this for a fact, but I thought it was 8 to 10 years in the US. So it is, they're expediting the process. And in doing so, they're doing that all over, especially during the COVID times, which what that does is it does not adhere to what's called free prior informed consent. And free prior informed consent is terminology that comes out of the universal rights for the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And and it's called UNDRIP for short, but a lot of Indigenous people don't like to shorten it. But free prior informed consent, as far as consent goes, there's always seems to be like a divide and conquer tactic that's taken by not only the government, but also by mining companies. When they want to get a mine in, they want to work with the people, of course, in the community that want the mine to go through because of jobs, because of bribes, because of whatever other reasons, like economic resources it may bring to the tribe. So on one hand, we have the Fort McDermott Indian tribe, and they're exercising their right to development, and they're working with lithium. And but there's another tribe, and that's they call themselves a colony, and they have members who are Washoe, Paiute, and Shoshone. And so some of their relatives, their ancestors, were massacred at the proposed mine site, Thacker Pass, Pimaha area. And so they have an interest in stopping. Yeah.
We have a little lag here. You are already moving into the question that we asked you, so I'd like to state the question for our audience here, and then let you continue with this, so that they know where we're going here. So the question we had for you was, what do we mean when we say we want this transition to be just, and why should we want it to be just? And especially with regard to how the transition or the transformation, as Jim said, and the mining affects Indigenous peoples. So Sioko, if you want to continue with the response to that, we'd be glad to hear it.
Okay. If you're seeing my ear, that's because I'm trying to listen closely to my phone. But anyways, that's my earring. Okay, so so as you know, for the green energy transition, the so-called green energy transition, they want to mine more. They want, I seen a Forbes article that said that they wanted that they technically need 300 new mines, 300 new mines to mine lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and graphite. And these mines would be global, they would mine all over the world. But what we know in this country, from another article that was published, was that many of the mines are on or near indigenous communities, if not directly on our territories and lands. And the stance of the Indigenous Caucus is that, our lands have already been overdeveloped by mines, by the fossil fuel economy. And these mines that are coming up to fix the climate change are not a real solution. It's a false solution. And so we're saying, keep it in the ground where it belongs. And in the COP, I was hearing people talk about that there's no need to mine these 5 things, that we have enough of these metals in the world in circulation already, and that we need to focus on reusing, recycling, remanufacturing all of our metals so that we can reduce mining or eliminate it totally. So we have to look at that, and like the last speaker said, we need a total different societal change. Like, we need to really think about things differently. And here at the COP, they're promoting land back for Indigenous peoples. They're promoting, and when we say land back, we're talking about returning lands to tribals people to manage. We have existed as Indigenous peoples for millennia, and it hasn't been till the last 500 plus years that the industrial complex, everything has destroyed Mother Earth, and much of Mother Earth, and that we should be trying to save what we have. And not wreck the valuable places that we maintain thus far. So let's see what else. I wanted to also talk about some of the ways that mines operate, and the water. The water is destroyed by mining. I mean, it's contaminated. We know this. At Thacker Pass, they mentioned that the lithium mine there would use 1.7 million gallons of water a day. And we know that's an arid desert climate environment. And to deplete the water at this point, when so many places on the West Coast and the Southwest are struggling for water, it's just, we cannot drink oil, we cannot drink contaminated water. We need water. Everyone needs water to survive. So here at COP today, we had a water ceremony where we gathered waters from all over the world and brought them together to pray for the water, because here on the continent of Africa, they are in a severe drought. And we heard from one African woman who talked about the young girls, how we are so privileged to just turn on our tap, but the young women here in her community in Africa, they have to walk for miles and miles to look for water, and then dig a hole to try to find some water. And they have to do this every day before they go to school. And so we really need to look at how mining impacts the water, and how we can, I mean, yeah. So water needs to be safeguarded going forward in climate change, and it is a major issue here. And more issues of concern among Indigenous peoples here are about violence against women, as it relates also to Mother Earth as the first female entity. And how, as we know, many women are sex trafficked due to the man camps around mining. And so all of that is not acceptable. And so digging holes in the spirit of Mother Earth, the flesh of Mother Earth, it should not continue, because it's not sustainable development. And we cannot call it development in any way, because it's destruction. And so in the just transition that they're talking about here at the COP, the Indigenous people said that that we need to keep the metals in the ground and just enjoy the land for its beauty, and that we have to keep on fighting for it, even if we're struggling here at the COP. It's a real struggle for us, where our voices are pretty much silent here. It's been very, very difficult to have any impact on the states and the language, but we're here nevertheless, and we have put out some statements within the UN system, and a lot of this is covered. And they're also asking for climate retribution for the loss and the damage due to climate change. And some of the loss and damage, in my opinion, is yet to come, because if we continue on and mine more, then we're going to see more and more loss and damage in all of the communities all across Mother Earth, and not just Indigenous people. I mean, all across North America, South America, everywhere. These 300 mines that they're saying we need are not needed. We need to find a different way, a new route. And the Indigenous people are willing and able, with Indigenous knowledge, to try to assist the earth, to try to assist in this whole entire process. But we also need resources, and we have been promised them, but so far they're forthcoming. So we want to keep an eye on certain things. One of them is the ocean mining. I heard from a man in the Fiji Islands over in that region that they are looking to mine the ocean. And to me, that's as bad as the idea of changing the clouds, the reflection of the clouds. Like, you hear all these weird, crazy technology fixes over here, and it just blows your mind, because technology is not going to save us. Technology is not going to save the world, especially with mining. We cannot mine the earth and destroy the earth to save it. It's just like common sense. But over here at the COP, we say it's a cop out, and we're very disappointed that it's been how many years? It's been a lot of years, and we still aren't seeing real reductions in emissions. You know, you have the carbon captures.
Sorry. But thank you. I know there's a timeline here.
Okay.
We've talked among ourselves about the need to consider the impacts on Indigenous communities with mining, but you have provided, first of all, details from your own experience of what mining does to Indigenous communities, and some of the nonsense, as you say, that's going on at the COP conference. there, and we really appreciate those details that you've provided, and we will be getting back to you to hear more about that as well. I want to now invite, well, I'm gonna ruin your name, but to respond to the question that we put to you about what structural alternatives are being proposed to this massive increase in mining and mines. How do we work to make this transition a transformation instead of a transition, as both Jim and Sayoko have pointed out? We proceeded with abuse of peoples, abuse of the earth. We use way more energy than we can expect to have available in the future. And that's the transformation we need. Just moving to new sources of energy is not the answer. So if you can go ahead and tell us what you see as how we can negotiate this being slave. Please say your name again, help me out here.
Yes, Mary, my name is Vuisile. Yes, so as Mary mentioned, I'll be speaking about alternatives. I'm from the Making Clean Energy, Clean, Just and Equitable campaign. And so before I begin with my presentation on the alternatives, just to give a bit of background, some of you might already know that Earthworks has 30 years of experience supporting communities at the front line of mining, oil and gas extraction in the US. And as Mary mentioned, we think of this just transition as an opportunity moment. So it's not just about transitioning to low carbon, but how do we reduce our dependence on irresponsible mining? And Sayoko mentioned, some of the harms that Indigenous communities face at the forefront of potential mineral extraction. And so for us, when we think about the just transition, it's about not replicating the harms of the fossil fuel industry. I'm aware that, as members of Northern Plains, you fought against the fossil fuel industry. And so you're very aware of how harmful that could be. And there's a risk that with the transition to renewable energy, those harms are replicated. Jim mentioned, how much mining would be needed. And so it's about thinking about how we can make sure that those harms are not replicated, how we can make sure we move away from such a dependence on mining, how we cannot greenwash the narrative. Jim mentioned that, in a lot of these mining magazines, the mining industry has been couching this just transition as something that that requires the ramp up of mining. And under the same conditions in the US with the 1872 mining law that doesn't protect the environment, that doesn't protect Indigenous peoples, that doesn't recognize free, prior, and informed consent, this will result in justifying mining in sacred sites in places such as Alaska in the US, in other countries such as Argentina, Chile. Sayoko mentioned deep sea mining. That's also something that's being proposed under the name of a just transition. And so it really is important to think about alternatives. And as Northern Plains, members of Northern Plains, thinking about alternatives and thinking about how you could enter the conversation of a just transition, there are three levers of change. So three big buckets that you can consider when it comes to entering the conversation of a just transition and thinking about what your role would be and what your focus would be in this discussion. So the first big bucket is about shifting consumption and transportation. And Jim hinted at this in his presentation about how we just need a shift as a society. We need to shift the amount of consumption that we do as a society, particularly countries in the global north. There is this narrative that the just transition means shifting from your internal combustion engine car to an EV car. How do we shift the consumption so we actually develop mass public transit that can connect cities and that can also benefit marginalized communities in the US so that they also can benefit from a decarbonized public transit system? There are also other circular economy strategies that could be incorporated when we think about a just transition. So these circular economy strategies would include thinking about how batteries are designed. So from the outset, when you're an OEM or a car company, tech company, when you're thinking about your designs and the products that you're making, how can you ensure that you design them so that they form, so that afterwards you implement a take back policy, you take back those products and you're able to disassemble them and then reuse them into your production. The second big bucket when it comes to alternatives is about boosting recycling and minimizing toxicity. So to the extent that we've shifted consumption, we've built out mass public transport, but we still need to consume goods. How do we ensure that those goods are being recycled and are feeding back into recycling, and that we're minimizing toxicity and reducing waste? So when it comes to boosting recycling, you could think about the policy interventions that would be needed to encourage metals recovery and recycling. I'm sure some of you are aware that right now in the US and in a lot of countries in the global north, it's actually cheaper to mine and process and develop a product than it is to have a take back policy that collects all your goods from wherever they are in the world and then recycle them. That's very expensive. And there are lots of policies that make it difficult for waste to travel from country to country. But what type of policy interventions could change that? So companies are actually incentivized to take back the products that they've produced and incorporate them back into their manufacturing processes. Another intervention when it comes to minimizing toxicity would be extending product life and repurposing. And also what I mentioned here about, product take back requirements, designing for disassembly so it's easier to incorporate those products into your manufacturing, and prioritizing the health and safety of workers to ensure that there are no new sacrifice zones or injustice. And this final point about minimizing toxicity goes to a lot of what Sayokla was saying in her presentation about not wanting to think of places as sacrifice zones, and specifically indigenous places as sacrifice zones. How do we prioritize the safety of communities and frontline communities? The final bucket that could be an intervention is about responsible mineral sourcing. So in the instance where we've shifted consumption and we've minimized consumption, we have public transit, and we're now recycling, there are those instances where you can't recycle for all the material needs of the just transition. And in those instances, how do we ensure that the minerals that are sourced are sourced responsibly? Jim mentioned, of course, that, there is no such thing as a good mine. All mines will have negative impacts. And so it's about how do we limit the impact of these mines? How do we ensure that there's strong environmental laws in the 1872 mining law, for example, so that communities are protected, so indigenous communities are protected, and so they have their free, prior, and informed consent. So I've spoken broadly about sort of the three types of interventions and alternatives that you can think about when it comes to a just transition. And as Northern Plains, you might be more inclined to, for example, focus on how do we spread the narrative on shifting consumption and transportation, or how do we focus on boosting recycling, or how do we ensure responsible mineral sourcing? So there are lots of different places you can sort of intervene when it comes to the conversation of a just transition. And so I'll now be moving to just give an example of what this could look like. In the European Union, just skip that. In the European Union right now, a regulation is being considered by the EU Parliament on batteries and waste batteries. And the reason why this was proposed was because the European Union recognizes that batteries and battery production is going to be a strategic imperative for Europe in the context of a clean energy. And so what this law aims to do is to address the risks of an increased demand in batteries by promoting a circular economy and by reducing the impacts throughout the battery life cycle. So this isn't a final law. It's still being discussed, and the negotiations continued and resumed on the 11th of October. They were closed for the summer. And so the legislation will likely be finalized early on in 2023. And some of the some of the considerations that the legislation will be addressing are the mineral demand, so what we call transition minerals. How do we ensure that along each transition mineral that is used for battery production, we have due diligence? How do we ensure that all companies make sure that along those transition mineral supply chains, they do due diligence and make sure that there's no environmental and human rights violations along those supply chains? And so the law wants to make that due diligence mandatory for all companies. Other issues that will be covered by the legislation, but that still need to be discussed, as I mentioned, it isn't finalized, is about the scope of the batteries that would be covered in the type of business. So our NGO partners in the EU are looking to make sure that the law covers all types of batteries, so from cell phone to portable to EV batteries to e-bikes, and also that all types of businesses are covered in this law. So from small to medium enterprises to the big companies, how do we make sure that all of them are subject to this law? Another thing that is being considered is a liability regime to provide remediation for harm. And what our NGO partners in the EU are arguing is that all companies that are headquartered in the EU have supply chains that span all over the world. And how do those communities at the forefront of those supply chains, or that are impacted negatively by those supply chains, how can they hold the EU-based companies responsible? Another thing that is being considered is the role of third-party verification schemes. And so here, what the law will be looking at is, as I mentioned, the law will make due diligence mandatory. It'll make it mandatory for all companies. And so the question is, if you use a certification scheme, how does that certification scheme count towards the due diligence that you've done? And the final thing that's being considered is the list of raw materials. Obviously, the ideal situation would be to have the most amount of transition minerals covered, and minerals such as aluminium, which are not considered transition minerals, but which will be required for the expansion of EV vehicles, because a lot of EV vehicles rely on aluminium, and the minerals such as steel that are not traditionally considered transition minerals, but with this transition, there will be a ramp up in demand in transition. So this is just an example of the type of policy interventions that are happening in the EU that look to address some of the negative impacts of this just transition. And as you can see from this draft law that is being considered, it looks at environmental impacts, human rights impacts. It tries to ensure that there's a liability regime. And so there really is a lot of scope when it comes to thinking about the just transition, to intervene at different places and to think about the different policy interventions that might be useful. I did mention that I do corporate campaigning, and so that's also another way you could enter this conversation, is about actually campaigning against companies directly and against their supply chains and the impact of their supply chains. So that's it from me. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak, and I look forward to the questions during the question and answer round.
Wow, thank you, Louisa. We have about 15 minutes before we get to the questions and answers, because we want to ask each of our speakers to respond to one more question. We heard about how complicated and difficult this is in technological in terms of physical limits. And we heard about the legal and policy difficulties and how complicated that is. And we've heard about the tremendous changes in treatment of people and how we approach both mining and so on, as with other cultures involved, and also just how we ourselves have to change, and those of us in the rich countries. So we have a question along those lines. It's for each of our speakers, and I'd ask each of you to just offer us a couple of suggestions about, about 5 minutes each. What can and should community organizations like Northern Plains be doing during this effort to build a new energy society? And so I'm going to ask Louisa to go first this time.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I'd like to say that the fact that you have this annual meeting and that you're discussing the just transition and your role within the just transition is a good step, right? Sort of getting a sense of what the scope is of the questions that are being asked and how you could be best placed to intervene as a community organization. And I think what community organizations have and the power that they have is firsthand experience. As Northern Plains members, you've been at the forefront of fossil fuel extraction. And so you know, and you can speak directly to policymakers, to companies about what those impacts look like on the ground. And so even with the just transition question and the just transition conversation, I would urge you as members to think about how you can bring your experiences at the forefront of mining to policymakers and to car companies. You know, as NGOs, sometimes some of the things that we think about and the things that we talk about can be high level, which is not ideal because at the end of the day, regardless of policies, people are the ones whose lives are impacted in these conversations. And so I think as a starting point, thinking about how as a community organization, you can look at different policy moments or speak to different companies that you know are going to be extracting in your region, and how can you bring your lived experience to some of the things that they're proposing and some of the minerals that are being proposed. And I think that's the leverage that you have, that's the position that you have that a lot of other NGOs and policymakers and, you know, these high level people would not be able to understand, is the lived experience that you have as members of Northern Plains.
Thank you. Hey, and Speopa, you can give us about 5 minutes of wisdom on what we could be doing.
Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to this. When I work with the communities in WMAN, the front lines, a lot of time they're lacking in resources. And like, for example, one of like Ute Mountain Ute, they're the ones who are impacted by the uranium mill. And they didn't even have a computer. They were using their cell phone to organize. And so a lack of resources for frontline communities is always an issue. The infrastructure to fight mines, unwanted mining, bad projects isn't always accessible. So we have WMAN itself, we have a mining mini grant program, and it sustains on $250,000 a year. We're losing our major funder, which is True North. But through that $250,000, we're able to give away approximately 70 grants to frontline communities. And you know, we're looking for replacement funds for that. And so I ask you to keep in mind the need for resources for the frontline organizations beyond just the mini grant program, which is just a $4,000 mini grant. They need like a lot more resources than just that, not just money, but also technical and scientific and legal support as well. And so we're always thinking about ways that we can connect them with experts, but I think we have to look at it in a way that will be different in the future. And so like right now we have, you know, experts within our network, but they're consultants. And wouldn't it be awesome someday if we had our own hired full-time legal and technical and scientific experts with all of the proposals that are going to be coming through? We expect that the need for WMAN is going to have to be expanded. I would like us to be on the forefront of that. I would like us to be able to talk to communities about what they may experience if they have a lithium mine, what they may be, you know, what's going to happen to their environment. So that kind of information, as they head into, say, mutual benefit agreements, could be, you know, super important to them, to have the free prior informed consent, because it's not the mining company that's going to give it to them. And to just put them on that level playing field, I think, with information and resources and baseline studies and water testing and all of those things, is super important. And we have to find a way moving forward. And this is like a time when we could possibly do that, because there are funding out there right now for this green energy transition. We are seeing a little bit more funding come our way, but it's still not enough for communities. So please consider that. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Sayoko. And now, Jim, if you can tell us what you would have us do.
Well, you know, I'd first start by saying, if you can't notice, there's a common theme between what we're all three talking about. It's not pre-rehearsed, but you can tell it just comes out. Specific to Northern Plains, it's interesting. So I work with the Good Neighbor Agreement. And that agreement, as many of you know, has been around for 20 plus years now. You can't, you know, and it's a good example of how ideally companies provide for and interact with citizens, allow citizens a real meaningful voice in what they do and other things. But you can't do that without organizational capacity like what Northern Plains Resource Council provides. Simply, a conversation between the parties simply would not have happened, nor could it have been maintained now for 20 plus years. Also, you know, the funding capacity that we have to have the technical advisors work with the company to get the studies, all those things, that's something that is made possible. And the high level of citizen involvement, again, that's involved, is made possible because of the capacity of Northern Plains and how you train, apply your organizational, you know, your staff, many of whom I've had the pleasure of working with over the past 25 plus years now. So that's something that maybe I always think about, is there some way Northern Plains could think about it or work, the Western Organization of Resource Councils who you work with, could you have a national academy where you bring people in from other places, help them learn as organizers in this very well organized and thought out program that you've had effective here in various other places. Yeah. And as Sayoko, you know, showing. Now, another thing I'll mention to you, this is all going to come, you know, right now in Montana, this is not at our front door. Now it's going to come to your front door before you know it, just like it is in other places. But let me just give you one example. Right now, next to the Stillwater complex, and Stillwater is mining a vein of ore that's steeply dipping, that's maybe 2 to 3 meters or 10 feet wide. What's next to it, though, and Stillwater Mining Company is looking at this, Siboney Stillwater isn't, but what's right next to it is a great big copper, chrome, nickel, PGM deposit that's very low grade, would require open pit mining, block cave mining. But actually, as all of us keep fighting about where to mine, as other places they say no, the target there becomes more yes. And I think we'll probably be talking about that one sooner than later. Certainly the company has changed its name to Strategic and Green Metals or something like that. And then the third thing I'd mention, and this happened to me about 3 years ago when I was flying to a conference in Ottawa, Canada, and somehow or other it was a renewable energy decarbonization discussion, and they invited me to talk about tailings storage facilities, which I work on a lot. And I can't really remember even today the tie between why I was there and the subject matter. But I remember flying up there, and as I was flying there, and this gets more to what we can do, each of us personally, occurred to me that at least, well, if I'm going to this kind of a conference, I should take the time to think for a few minutes about my own personal carbon consumption. And I ran across a website that actually allowed me to calculate what my own personal consumption was. And, being in North America, and this is what you have to look at, and, living in a rural location, I live in the upper Big Hole Valley, 60 miles from the nearest town. It's, the reality is that we are huge carbon consumers. For me, travel was, I don't even want to talk about it. Okay. It was making me feel guilty. But do this. It gives you a chance and gives you a realization of what we do, what's happening and how we're causing these things. And at least might help you to sit and think about, are there particular places in my own personal behaviors in different ways that I can change what I'm doing that might reduce that carbon consumption or load? So those are my 3 ideas. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jim. All the waiting for questions and answers. And how much time do we have left for this? 20 minutes. 20 minutes. All right, that's great. But let's, the more focused your question can be, questions about the ultimate fate of the universe or anything. And if you want to direct your question to one of our speakers in particular, please say that, or if you want each of them to respond, say that. So, let's see. I will alternate between questions on Zoom and questions from the room. And do we have any questions on Zoom? I'm sorry, we can't take questions from Zoom. Oh, well, listen. So, any questions?
Yes.
Do you have a mic to take over?
Sorry, I'm standing here, but there's no mic here.
We'll carry a mic around.
So my first, well, it's gonna start off with a comment, I guess, and then a little ask, a little reflection at the end. And you can, first of all, thank you, all of you, and Jim for it is a fool's game for us to try to do just a transition where we keep doing the things we've been doing, but we just do a better version of the wrong thing, basically. And so it seems to me that there's energy efficiency is a huge thing with our buildings, but vehicles, it's not just a matter of changing to an electric vehicle and keeping driving the same amount we do. It's about having our communities transition back to the way they historically were and the way they evolved over millennia, which is as walkable communities. It's not just a matter of us all now getting on electric public transit. It's about walking and being able to bike and also to relocalize in terms of our smaller communities like Forsyth and others that have been, people drive all the way to Billings now to do their shopping in ways that the small towns have lots of vitality. I'm finding now as a member of city council that there are ways of reprioritizing funds we already have right now with transportation money. The most expensive transportation system you can have is one that's optimized for single occupant vehicle use. And so we find that actually making a very fiscally conservative argument of reprioritizing our money to have a higher density, more walkable neighborhoods, actually through like the strong towns movement and other such things, is actually, I'm finding, is well received across the political spectrum as well. So I think in terms of us as Northern Plains, what can we be doing is we have the most sphere of influence within our own communities, not just what happens overseas, and certainly there's things we can do that way as well. But I think we as an organization can really start to work in our own communities about how we can relocalize more and and improve those relationships amongst people and revitalize our communities. I guess maybe the question is just maybe let's start with Jim. But how does this sound to you?
No, well, let me just give you an example, and I think this applies universally to some extent, but particularly I think with our society we've developed here. And remember, I live in the upper Big Hole Valley, a few miles from Wisdom, Montana. So many of us live in these kind of rural communities, and we have a local store in most of those places. Now, as you just mentioned, a lot of us travel. In my case, I might go into Butte or Dillon, but those are relatively close. But a lot of folks travel in remotely to Billings, various other places in Montana. Now, if we actually could work with, for example, that local store owner, provide them the resources, agree to do our shopping with them, if they will, not just for groceries, but for a lot of different things. And by the way, I'm trying to figure out how we would do this in a place like Wisdom, and there's an opportunity. But if you could organize people, get folks together, and as you said, you would bring a lot of very interesting, diverse people together in doing this, to utilize that, encourage the ability to place your orders, let them go to town, do your shopping, have one truck and trailer or several or a larger truck just go in and do that kind of thing and only have that one trip. It encourages both your local economy, but brings people together in a common effort, causes you to all have to go to the store together and actually intermingle, which surprisingly isn't a natural thing. So that's just one example I would kind of throw out that, and again, I sometimes wonder if Northern Plains, that's not the kind of thing, even though it gets into a bit of the economic side, at least in some ways, it might be the kind of thing we can help bring about. We have a lot of communities in that situation.
Thank you, Jim. Does anybody else have a speech? I mean, a question? Okay, raise your hand. We have a couple of mics.
Okay. I saw Edwin from Tom Tully and then Steve. And we'll go back here then.
Probably mostly for Jim, but are there other battery technologies or are there any battery technologies that don't require hard rock mining?
Well, that's that very, very quickly. There's, if you will, kind of Rube Goldberg devices where you could pump water up, let it release, but actually the turbines require mining. So the brief answer is no. That's the problem. No matter how you look at this, you're going to require mining.
Mary, you mentioned something about Zoom. I thought you said Doom. And, I was reasonably optimistic until I sat through this morning. But one thing that was never mentioned here was anything remotely related to nuclear energy. And I know this is a subject that some of your committees have struggled with, and whether you were going to make any reference to that in any of your motions. In Red Lodge, we have some friends that have a daughter who's a scientist who now works remotely and lives in Red Lodge. And she works for a company that is designing small frame nuclear power sources that they feel they've solved the waste issues, and they think that it could be a great food for many smaller communities and other places to provide cheap, reliable energy. And I'm wondering, these things we've talked about are so internationally complicated when you look at population trends and what is happening in other countries, to think that we're going to make some great move here in Montana, I think really strains credulity. But I'm wondering if any of our speakers would have any comment about what reliable nuclear energy could do, what effect it could have on need for all of these environmental degradations that we see are going to take place through mining and the other efforts that we have to provide energy.
Who wants to take that? Jim? Were you waiting it off?
Do either one of the other speakers, let me ask if either one of the others want to take this one on.
Sayoko, did you have anything you wanted to say about that?
Mary, can you tell her she's on?
Oh, Sayoko, you're on mute. If you can unmute yourself, or can you do that here? Okay,
With the problems with storage, it's not the answer. It's really not the answer. We need to move away from it. It's not green energy.
Thank you for that. We do have a question for Joe.
I just want to add,
Oh.
that there are people who feel they have solved the storage problems on different scales than those that we've already experienced. So I don't think that we can ignore this as a subject that should be explored further.
Yeah, and you know, it's big, but that's true. We have a question on Zoom. So somebody want to read that out for us?
All right, this question is from Lori Benjamin. What might our approaches be to battery and renewable energy manufacturers to encourage them to get involved in the circular economy?
Yeah, I'll start, and I think perhaps Vasily has some comments on this as well, looking at it from the recycling end in particular and things. But simply the best way that we can make a difference in what is going to happen is for consumers to make a demand, and how you make that demand is how you buy. So there are systems and things being set up, always at risk of greenwashing and other things, that are intended to allow folks to identify at the consumer end if you can buy from a mine that mines under better standards, takes a better approach. And those systems are literally being developed today. Right now, you really literally can't buy metal under any of these certification systems. But examples are out there, such as the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance and others that are trying to do that. And again, I caution that it's something that even with the best effort, I'm part of that effort at IRMA, you're always subject to the whole thing of greenwashing. So that's really the connection that's going to happen, that allows for this connection to be made in what we do each day and what we buy and consume.
Thank you. And you reiterate that this really is your turn that you got to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to echo a lot of what Jim said about individually as consumers, what you can do, but then as an organization, you can weigh in on a lot of, so for example, Jim mentioned that there might be mining companies that would be coming. And so as an organization, organizing on the ground and saying that, we don't want mining to occur under these circumstances, because these mining companies have a track record of exacerbating these impacts. There are also, just to take it globally for a few seconds, renewable energy also has a lot of issues, right? There are lots of communities, for example, in Kenya, whose lands have been displaced because of solar farms being built. There are also lots of issues with some hydro dams that have been built that have been impacting communities. And so what some initiatives and investors have done is speak to investors of renewable energy companies to ask them, what are the impacts downstream of what your renewable energy manufacturing is doing, right? So that's also something that you could look at as an organization. If you have renewable energy initiatives that are coming in your area or in your region, try to figure out and ask those questions about, well, if we are building out renewable energy, or if we want to build renewable energy in Montana, what would that look like? How can we ensure that we build renewable energy in Montana, but that there are no harms in terms of the environment and to communities where the actual facilities will be built out. So yeah, you can look at it as a consumer. You can also look at it as an organization. How can we make demands upfront about the conditions under which we want renewable energy to be expanded in Montana, if that's the question?
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for at least one more question from the room. Who has the mic? I got it. Carol, over here. Yeah, my question and comment is, what are we going to do about I just heard this, I guess, other third world countries and other countries that are gathering together and looking at the big countries that have caused us, all the pollution and everything, and they're getting together and sending us a bill for the cost of all this on their people. And if we're outsourcing our refining and causing problems in their country also, we have to realize that, you know, who's gonna end up paying that bill if we don't get up and, you know, the industries that says we've already paid for this, now it's your turn. Because they'll try to pass it on to us. I know, because I used to work for them. Did you have a question, Carol?
I was wondering how we're gonna do that. How we're gonna, anybody have any ideas?
I don't know if you could hear Carol, it's just, you know, your thoughts on what's been called reparations or the loss and damage provisions, which I know are being talked about there at the COP27. So any comments there? Seiko, am I seeing you nodding? There.
I'm trying to unmute.
You're done. You did it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your question. As far as loss and damage and climate reparations, yes, we definitely need those. We have heard that climate damage has become a big business in Puerto Rico, and and it started with Hurricane Katrina, that there's corporations that are profiting from the damage that's caused by climate change. Well, we need to get the climate disasters. We know they're coming. Where's the funding for those going to come from? We have to figure that out as a society, because it seems every year it's getting worse and worse, and the loss and damage is worse and worse. And it's horrific. And the indigenous peoples globally are trying at this COP to obtain some of the funding that is going to be dispersed. There's something like $1.7 billion that was going to be dispersed. Well, when I was in one of the sessions that I attended here, it was the African indigenous peoples. There was a man who was part of one of the organizations that was funding the 1.7 billion. And he said at this point, indigenous peoples of Africa will receive 7% of the 1.7 billion for the whole of Africa. And it's not enough. And who knows where and how the money will trickle down. We know that doesn't work to the local people who need it most on the ground. We've heard that a lot of the funding goes to intermediaries, and it doesn't trickle down the way it should to grassroots. So there's problems on so many levels. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's, folks in the other parts of the world can tell us what the problems are, but what are we going to do about it? That's for us to invent. And it's pretty clear. I believe the gods who have ordained our agenda tell me that we're done for this session. And so I really want to thank all of you, Seoko Williams and Louisa Kube and Jim Kuipers. And Jim is no stranger to Northern Plains, but Louisa and Seoko are other. If you find yourselves in Billings, we can always manage to assemble some members to meet with you and visit with you and hear what you're doing and tell you more about ourselves. So thank you all for